Uh, I'm Lori Garducki. I direct the criminal justice program at the MacArthur Foundation. I'm so pleased and delighted to be here today. Although I understand my avatar stood in for me on Tuesday and probably gave you a better representation of the Safety and Justice Challenge. But we've partnered with SAMHSA on a number of different occasions and have also worked with BJA through OJJDP over the years, and we're pleased to be able to continue this public-private partnership, and we're particularly pleased to be here at the Best Practices Implementation Academy. I know many of you from Models for Change and or from the Safety and Justice Challenge, the implementation as well as the innovation sites are here. Others of you we've crossed paths through our various travels, and I know this is a very dedicated and committed group that wants to learn more and go deeper into the issues. So our charge this afternoon is to look at racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system and what the problems and the issues and potential solutions are. I think it's particularly timely to have this conversation in the month of April, in that earlier this month was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. At some point was the release of the Kerner Commission. I was giving remarks at the University of Toledo, and I made reference to Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And so it's been a period of reflection for me to think about where we are and where we stand when it comes to law and society and racial justice, which is also implied to be thinking about social and economic justice as well. It is certainly one of the pillars of the Safety and Justice Challenge where we think about, where we say our initiative is to change the way America thinks about and uses jails, and in that to address the issues around the misuse and overuse of jails and also tackle the problem of racial and ethnic disparities. So I'm delighted to be here with two individuals who have a deep background, knowledge, and experience in addressing these issues nationally as well as locally. So James Bell, no? I'm not going to read it. But I just wanted to make sure I got your title correctly.
Okay, thank you.
I've worked with him for over 20 years. He is the founder and president of the W. Haywood Burns Institute. And the Burns Institute, we were pleased to be one of their partners when James was first at the Youth Law Center and then spun out to start the Burns Institute, and then continued to work with him on our juvenile justice work. They've worked in 25 states, countless local jurisdictions addressing these issues. He's a nationally recognized spokesperson on these concerns and issues. He's joined by Abby Stamp, who we've gotten to know because Multnomah County is one of the implementation sites for the Safety and Justice Challenge. She's the executive director of the Multnomah Local Public Safety Coordinating Council and is responsible for directing and coordinating interagency public safety policy discussions and intergovernmental projects to improve the efficacy of the county's public safety system, which means she's got a lot on her plate. So Abby will address these issues from a local perspective. James will look at it more broadly about the questions he thinks all of you, as policymakers and decision makers with respect to your jurisdictions, what you should be thinking about with respect to these issues of addressing racial and ethnic disparities, racial, social, and economic justice. So they're each going to take some time to speak and give you an overview, but what I'm really hopeful for is we can engage them and all of you in a conversation and dialogue. So with that, James.
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Great. Are you all post-lunch? You got itis? You about ready to start sleeping? Okay. Itis is a cultural term. White folks, it's food coma. Okay. So I want to thank Lori and Lark for inviting me to your Best Practices Implementation Academy. This topic, no matter where you sit it in the agenda, for some folks, in the justice sector and the health sector, this topic is seen as unnecessary, uncomfortable, and confusing. Or if you don't feel those things, it represents a foray into the overwhelming. For others, it's a conversation long overdue, important, and necessary for public servants in the administration of justice. I hope that my short remarks are informative, reflective, and interesting, regardless of where you land on that continuum, and can be of assistance to you as you continue to approach this topic when you go back home. So I just want to begin by raising a couple of issues that I believe are important in the engagement of equity and disparities in the administration of justice for law violations that include behavioral health problems. The first issue involves examining your goals that you might have set for yourself regarding treatment courts and racial and ethnic disparities. Is the goal that you've set, is what you're doing when you go home, what's your goal? Is it a numerical progress in some way, defined by some type of formula, that when we started we had X number of this, and now that we're doing this, we should have Y number of that? Is that your goal? Or are they involved with wellness measurements or outcomes that show up less in numbers, but may be evident in behavior change that might be molecular and not automatically apparent? I ask that question because it seems that whether you have numerical measurements or less data-driven metrics, how you get there matters regarding racial and ethnic disparities. Is your approach to use tools and technologies that you control only within your sector? Or will achieving your goals require engaging other agencies and or the larger societal context in which law violations occur? For example, will your approach as a justice practitioner be an exploration into, let's say, the mechanisms involved in the deployment of and operations of electronic monitoring? Is that going to be our focus, our tool or technology that we think will get us from X to Y? Or will it be about engaging in the conditions that send so many folks in your sector to need electronic monitoring in the first place? These are two very different approaches. SAMHSA and other health leaders and practitioners introduced and developed the notion of the social determinants of health. That notion expanded the idea of health beyond using tools like the stethoscope and blood pressure cuff to examine the social context in which patients make decisions that impact what the stethoscope hears and the blood pressure cuff measures. So you could define health as putting in a stethoscope and listening to your heart and say it's 40 or it's 106. Thank you very much, next. Or you can ask, why is your heart so low and why is it beating so fast? Why is your blood pressure normal and why is your blood pressure off the roof? Whereas on the other hand, in the justice sector, there are very few examples of expanding the idea of addressing public safety by mitigating the social determinants of law violations. That's a new term I'm throwing out for you guys. We have social determinants of health. What are the social determinants of law violations? Social determinants such as witnessing violence, worrying about whether your immigrant father will be home for dinner or deported, fearing that your sexual identity will make you a target for violence, or enduring chronic stress because the color of your skin makes you an object of fear when you walk down the street or sit in a Starbucks. Indeed, the justice apparatus has made tacit acknowledgments of the social determinants of law violations by creating a laundry list of boutique courts. We've stepped into that a little bit. There is, and you guys could, if we did it on the wall, you could do it for 20 minutes. It's amazing. Veterans court, substance abuse court, mental health court. If we go into the youth side, drug court, truancy court, girls court, how to tie your shoes right court. we in the justice sector trying to deal with this social stuff. However, these are seen often as sideshows to the main administration of justice and the delivery of public safety. Do you have to coerce the judges to sit in that court? Can they wait to get out of there? When they get there, do they fall in love with it and never want to leave? But it's really not a part of court, because if you're going to run for attorney general, you may not want to say my career was drug court. Evidence of the status is the budgets allotted to these efforts operating outside the more usual court processes of arrest, bail, confinement, charging, and trial. Research shows that life outcomes impacted by toxic stress and poor health because of their exposure to violence, chronic poverty, racism, and unconscious bias really suck and inevitably lead. Those life outcomes, when you come from those neighborhoods that are exposed to that, those life outcomes suck. And they inevitably lead to the justice sector at society's significant expense. There is very little in the human experience more fundamental than feeling safe. Fear is a powerful, it's almost undefinable for us humans, a very powerful emotion that informs so much of our personal life and our institutional behavior. Our institutions that we set up are set up with in mind our human sense of fear, and certainly the justice sector. And the justice sector is increasingly being asked to solve problems that involve social determinants of racial and ethnic disparities that it does not see as part of its public safety mandate. So on the extremities, that's for sociologists, that's for social workers, that's for therapists. That ain't us, we got cuffs. We got 6x9. Thus, many in the justice sector feel that the larger society has asked them to address a problem, and they're not wrong. The justice sector is not wrong for this. To address a problem not of their making and that they are not equipped to handle. It is this pressure that makes justice professionals look for quick fixes, tools, technologies, and some type of evidence-based wizardry. This pressure is in some cases applied to the technical assistance providers to pull a non-existent rabbit out of a hat that has no magic in it. We just had this thing. What do we do to fix it? And getting results on racial and ethnic disparities continue to remain out of reach, frustrating, and to many justice practitioners in your jurisdiction, and something that feels that it should be addressed. We know that in some way, we're there every day with the processing of this. We know that we should address it, but man, it feels like a giant pain in the ass. What do we do? We're trying, we've tried. People have been talking about this for 30 years. Now here comes whoever you fill in the blank. MacArthur, Burns, Bell, Abbey, whoever. Giant pain in the ass. Gigantic. And we could go through a similar trajectory for our mental health colleagues. Giant pain in the ass for them too. The bottom line, in my opinion, is that it's unlikely that we are going to be able to arrest, jail, charge, incarcerate, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, FFT, ART, or any other T that you're using out there out of our inequity unless we work differently. There ain't enough therapists. There ain't enough T's. There ain't enough jail cells. There ain't enough cops. There ain't enough cuffs. Which brings us back to the original question. As you sit here, what is your approach and measurables? What are the confines and possibilities of your mission within this structure that you've signed on to? Public safety or community health? Can you separate how you do business from the larger community context of American civil society? Can you separate it? That we just do this outside the context of the larger civil society. I try to make the case for you to think about. This is after lunch, by the way. And, by tomorrow, you'll be back in business, or Monday. But just something for you to think about. I believe the answer has to be no, because the larger community context was used to give you your mission in the first place. So to try to wall yourself off from the larger community context now, what I'm giving to you for you to digest, think about, object to, disagree with, is it's too late, you can't do it. The larger community context set up the systems that you're working in. And so for you to then ignore them now is not an option. You can keep trying, but there's a wave a-coming. What do I mean by that? I mean that the justice and health sectors today are built on and continue to employ the larger society's racialized DNA. DNA. This is the part where some folk get uncomfortable, and I've already seen one brother nodding his head. And this is what happens at this part of the talk. I'll be pulled up in the hallway, Brother Bell, thank you so much. And other people be like, hate it. Same old, we heard it all the time. A study released last month by the Journal of the National Medical Association examined our societal racialized DNA as it relates to the shooting of unarmed black men. Oh, they put a disclaimer? Good. Definitely disclaim me. Definitely disclaim me. They're like, okay, so y'all read the disclaimer. So don't get Lark upset. Don't call Lori. Lori's like, I told y'all, don't call me. Here's the relationship between structural and black-white disparities and fatal police shootings. Get this study. It just came out about 10 days ago. Threat. Two competing theories, as there often is, that racial disparities in police shootings can be explained by racism and its influences on the interaction between law enforcement officials and black suspects. Or the other way of looking at it is the way the law enforcement community might often come back to this and say, no, it's not racial. It is disparities in the occurrence of lethal force by police is a direct response to the higher number of interactions that law enforcement officials have with black individuals due to higher rates of violent crime in the black community. So it is structural racism, the larger context, or no, it's y'all. Y'all are wilding out and crazy, and thus we have to control you. Those are the two theories, and they're not going away. Among the state racism measure, so in this study is a definition of structural racism, which I invite you to read and agree or disagree with. Residential segregation was the most robust indicator associated with state-level racial disparities in police shootings of unarmed victims. This ain't Black Lives Matter, y'all. This ain't justa causa. This is physicians, what's the word, Lori, help me? Peer review, peer review, all that. Controlled and exponential with all that stuff they do. Okay, so this ain't us. This ain't us, just no justice, no peace people. This is y'all, okay? And that racial residential segregation is the primary basis for a range of social, economic, employment, educational, criminal justice, political inequalities between blacks and whites. Next, we acknowledge that the reality that an examination of where people exercise, everybody in this room, me, you, all of us. This ain't a critique. This is what we must wake up to. Where people exercise the most choice in their daily lives that reflect their entitlements and privileges are two places, first off. One, where folks choose or are allowed to live. Think of your neighborhood that you're driving home to right now. Currently, America is as segregated now as it was before the Fair Housing Act. That's not government. That's nobody with a gun to your head. That's us as citizens deciding we want to live segregated and we like it. Or where we choose or allowed to get educated and have our kids get educated is the greatest perception of how we feel as civil society about race, It is. It's what we do involuntarily. And it reveals now that we are as segregated a nation, we are not colorblind in any way. So our choices are not colorblind, and neither are the institutions that we create colorblind, and they reflect and enforce those choices. Let's just admit it to ourselves. And it is the justice sector that is used for enforcement of the structural mandates that have been deliberately discriminatory and can often comprise the social determinants of law violation. So this begs the question of only responding to behaviors that violate the law, absent of context, or engaging in and taking responsibility for some of the context. Because the fact is, rarely does crime happen acontextually. That is rare. That is for the psychotic, crazy, I know we can't use that word in this room, but you know what I mean. Right, well, now you say that, I'm not gonna say that. So essentially, that is who most crime is contextual. Rarely is the person so whacked out that it's acontextual. And the civil society provides the reservoir, that is the source for the tributaries, which are supposed to wash over us equally and equitably. This slide comes from our health colleagues, because the justice people don't do slides like this. The justice people, we don't like it. We don't like race disaggregation in justice, because we are not going to give you ammunition to call us racist. So the health field, the education field are way ahead of justice in data around this. Now this, I'm sure Lark has known this slide. This is the slide from health. This is Kansas. Okay, those of y'all from Kansas and Missouri, y'all know this. If you look at this slide, look at Blue Hills. The average age is 69. 3 miles down the freeway. 3 miles down the freeway in Armour Hills, what's the lifespan there? 83. In 3 miles different. Now I'm gonna tell y'all folks, that ain't secondhand smoke. Okay? That's some structural stuff going on at 3 miles different. You can have that kind of life expectancy. Inequities by race and ethnicity for the purposes of this gathering are deeply rooted and part of the structural fabric woven almost imperceptibly, but deliberately, by policies, practices that are born of discrimination. That's what they're born of. And we could play a game if they gave me all afternoon. You give me 3 policies, you give me 3 steps, I'll get you back to race. I will. I'll get you back to race. I'm gonna show you some in a couple minutes. The justice sector cannot isolate itself from this reality. It tries to, but it can't. Bringing into sharp focus the idea that my normal may not be your normal. It is not a concept on the periphery for the communities that most populate your jails, but rather for them, it is front and center. Front and center are the deliberate decisions made to keep us in segregated neighborhoods. Rock Ridge. I don't like to pick on the South. They're too easy. Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, it's just so easy. I want to pick on the progressive places where we don't have that. So Rock Ridge in the Bay Area is a neighborhood that a lot of people at my professional level aspire to come to. Craftsman-style houses, nice streets, BART station nearby, market hall where people like me can shop and get cheesy bread, $12 kale muffins. That's what we want. Let's look at Rock Ridge when it was built, because all neighborhoods didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Give me 3 policies, 3 decisions, I'll get you to race in these United States. What does it say? Rock Ridge, in the shadow of the Claremont Hotel, which is there when it was built, still there. Big luxury hotel. You might have gone to a conference there. 3 minutes, yes ma'am. No Negroes, no Chinese, no Japanese can build or lease in Rock Ridge Park. What was the sector to enforce that? Justice. Who were the police that when you were running through there, what are you doing here? Let's take two neighborhoods in Seattle. This is Broadmoor and Broadview neighborhoods. These are quotes. I've gone and got covenants from so many places around the country. No part of said property shall ever be used, these are names we don't even say anymore, by any Hebrew or person of Ethiopian, Malay, or anti-Asiatic race. Those people are serious, unless you're doing domestic service. No lot or portion shall be sold, leased, or occupied by any other person other than white or Caucasian, except this will not prevent you from having a maid who you give approval to. So the point is not that our justice apparatus and its participants are de jure racist, but it necessarily raises the question is, what is it about the American experience wherein race lives so deeply in the institutional fabric but can never be admitted? How do we engage a problem that we say we don't have? In order to be successful, we at Burns suggest that traversing the first hurdle is not about ferreting out racist actors, but it is deconstructing racialized structures. So here are my commendations to you. First, I commend that you lower fears and defensiveness as you examine your successes and challenges. This needs to be accompanied by a fierce culture of inquiry about what's working and what doesn't and how you do business. Next, develop strategic and smart ideas about how to negotiate politics in favor of equity. How do you get the electeds to see it's in their advantage to do equity? Not easy, but if you don't work on it, you'll never come up with the answers. Are we being smart and strategic about the use of the budgeting process to increase rather than reduce innovation? People don't like change. How do we get them to do change? Training in general, including implicit bias. Training in general, I'm gonna say this again, including implicit bias is not a result. It's just a tool. Don't think by giving that training you're gonna get different outcomes. It ain't gonna happen. Can your jurisdiction break down silos in ways that have not been experienced? Are we organized for incentives that argue against the principles of SJC because we don't want to do that? And how do we get adults to play well with each other while we're blaming the other people? So, do you embrace innovation that is not new hardware but requires soft skills? It's a question. So this is my last paragraph and I'm done, Ms. Garducki. Abby, are you okay with that? Okay, thank you. It was over 200 years ago that von Schiller gave us his immutable law of events. I'm gonna pass up the Still Two Americas on housing. I'm gonna pass up the slide on our schools being segregated. I've made those points. Treatment alternatives in the community, talk about that. A lot of stuff, I'm moving on. But it was over 200 years ago that von Schiller gave us his immutable law of events, stating that into today already walks tomorrow. Leading the world in incarceration with a national recidivism rate of 60% means it can't be crazy or radical to ask, can we do better? Indeed, it's good government to do better. And I would like to invoke two words that may not sit well for some people, but it is a challenge as we get closer and closer to 2040 when we will be a majority people of color country. Radical imagination. That's what I'm suggesting that we need. The private sector's got it. What are we doing in the public sector? And so what is it that it would look like? So I'm finishing with this. In 1890 or 1900, if you'd have asked people, what do you need for personal transportation? They would have said stronger or faster horses, because they could not imagine a horseless carriage. So here is a street, this is a shot of Fifth Avenue in 1900. You can see all the buggies. And I don't have a little laser pointer because of this setup, but in the 1900 slide, right over to the left, you can see a little car right behind the buggy. Just right, let's see, 1, 2, 3 buggies in on the left side. You can see just somebody in an automobile, whatever the hell that is. Look 13 years later. Look at Fifth Avenue 13 years later. See all those cars? So now the question is, where's the horse? And there's one little horse in a buggy right to the left, right by the building. If you see that building on the left, you'll see a hooded little buggy. 13 years. Radical imagination. So it is time that we began reimagining how we do safety, not for now, but for the future. Thanks.
So thank you, James, for these inspiring and instructive words, moving from the historical, structural, and institutional dimensions and that James has outlined. We're going to ask Abby to follow James, not an enviable task, to talk about, at least in Multnomah, how you're starting to address these issues.
No, it is not an enviable task. I saw his name next to mine and almost had an accident. I told him when I met him this morning I was a little bit starstruck about this. And actually the director, I should give you a shout out, Benjamin Duncan, the director of the Multnomah County Office of Diversity and Equity, is like, damn, Abby, you talking with James Bell? All right, you go get it. So what are we doing in Multnomah County? I just made about 4 slides, but a lot of what James talked about really told me it's important to talk about some context about where we are. Like all jurisdictions, Multnomah County has racial and ethnic disparities in both the juvenile and the adult justice systems. We have not fixed anything. We acknowledge that structural and institutional racism exists across the board. So I think we've got that. And I could imagine all of our stakeholders across the board nodding and agreeing with everything that was just discussed. So full disclosure, I am a left-leaning, liberal, born to hippies, social worker by training. So I have social justice, I think, pulsing through my veins. And I do a lot of training of cops. Actually, I've done some training in Pacific County where the culture there is very different than Multnomah County. And I think it's really important, no matter where we sit on the continuum of criminal justice, improvement, reform, whatever you want to call it, that we acknowledge that it's all important. The reforms and de-incarceration and also the safety and tactics that law enforcement requires to keep our communities safe is also a critical thing to do. So I think it's a both-and moment. Lastly, as the executive director of the CJCC in my county, so for all of you who are coordinators, project managers, you kind of sit in that coordination or direction position, we are not only cat herders, we are pot stirrers. And I think it's important for us to ask the really hard questions that politicians can be too scared to ask. So that's my call to action. Take a risk, use your privilege, and ask hard questions. So, Multnomah County has been engaged actually with James and the Burns Institute, the Anne E. Casey Foundation, and the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative since 1994. So there's been many decades of the county talking about disparities and understanding that we need to fix it. It hasn't been fixed. There was one year, I can't remember if it was like 2000 or 2001, where there was no disparity of African American youth in the Multnomah County Detention Facility for like maybe a year. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we had almost 2 years. Okay, but we haven't fixed it. However, it is important to share that the decision point analysis that juvenile reform work uses is still an incredibly valuable way to look at what's going on in your jurisdiction, to identify where the biggest problems are, and to move forward. So one of the people who works with us through the MacArthur work is Jennifer Ferguson, and she did a decision point analysis for our adult system, and that created a catalyst on our adult side to do something different. So I had a staff person who also did a literature review last year, and she came up with 2 findings. One, all boats don't rise equally. We were talking about this at a table earlier today, that when you do good justice reform, white folks are going to benefit more than everybody else. That's what's going to happen. And no jurisdiction has fixed it, right? So we're all in good company. That is all of our work. So data, 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 data. What are your metrics? What are your measurables? What does success look like? What's your goal? It should have a number. But as a facilitator of these conversations, policymakers like to dive headfirst into very deep rabbit holes and drag everybody else with them. So not only do we stir pots, we grab them by the feet and haul them back up and keep them attacked to our agenda. And I just wanted to say, get iterative. Ask questions, look at a decision point. Let's talk about booking. Oh, the disparity at booking is X%, or the relative rate index is this, whatever your metric is. Keep looking at it as you continue to evaluate and intervene at that decision point. I think most of you have seen this image floating around the interweb where there's equity versus the justice and equality. This is a new one that I saw, and I stole this from a friend who did a presentation at the Oregon Youth Authority. So this first image is really looking at inequity, right? Equality. Everybody got the same size box, but the poor little kid is too short and he can't see, or they can't see over the fence. So in the second image, then you've got where they're being more intentional than, oh, the little kid needs to be able to see, so give that little kid 2 boxes. But look at the adult on the left. Sorry, taller person. They had this wonderful overview when they all had 1 box, but he or she had to make sacrifices to be able to have the shorter person be able to see over the fence. So that is a sacrifice, a change, a something, a give. That's important to acknowledge. Ultimately, I think we want to get to the chain link fence, which is in this room not a great symbol, but it works. It's what it is. So we haven't eliminated structural and institutional racism in our communities. That's what that would look like, where the barrier and the problem is gone. But it's not. Maybe one day it will be, but it's not. So we have to think about those boxes and who gets them. What's that? Bicycles? Oh, all right. So there's a concept called targeted universalism. And so when we say that all boats don't rise equally, that means we need to target the communities we seek to help. And I'll give an example about what we're doing at Multnomah County that Jules got cut off on yesterday, talking about the program for women. And so it's risky, right, to take a risk and to name a group, a race, an ethnicity, a group of offenders or inmates or clients that have really disparate representation at a decision point, and to name it and call it out. Here's an example. We talk, and I'm really glad right now that no one from my jurisdiction is in the room, so I can tell these stories without feeling like I'm to get it. So I'm sharing some of our some of the processes that got us to I think a successful place. I'm trying to be strength-based here. When we were developing the LEAD program, one of the critical players who was advocating for it said, hey, we noticed in Jennifer Ferguson's decision point analysis that people of color, specifically African Americans, the arrest rate for possession of a controlled substance was like many, many times higher than the white population. And they narrowed down and found that possession of cocaine was 51 times higher for African Americans than white people. And so he was saying, so LEAD is going to decrease disparities for African Americans. And I said, well, this was a pot stirring moment. Is it going to decrease disparities because it's an Afrocentric program? Is it going to decrease disparities because African Americans are the only eligible folks? Are you going to decrease disparities because you're only going to contract with culturally specific providers? Are you going to decrease disparities because you're actually going to divert people who live in more African American neighborhoods? And they went nuts. One person in the room said, well, we can't do that because that's profiling. Then I said, then you can't say you're going to reduce disparities. So now the language is, Lori, close your ears, is we are going to reduce the number of people of color who are arrested and prosecuted for possession of a controlled substance. That is a true statement. So I made up this little balance because that story about LEAD, I think, illustrates our work. We have to balance political will and risk tolerance. When there's enough political will to make a shift, then that risk tolerance comes into place. And when the scales balance, change can happen. So just what James was talking about is figuring out how to work with and influence the right policymakers and the right politicians to take that risk. They need a viable alternative that they can trust to take a leap and do something that is really scary. So here's what we've got in terms of our targeted work to reduce, and the decision point here is African American women on supervision to probation received jail sanctions more often and were in jail for a longer length of stay. We hypothesize that is because of lack of cultural, gender, and trauma-informed alternatives. So we are opening a transitional housing unit that Truel showed a picture of yesterday. It's going to be 38 beds. It will be straight up, it is an Afrocentric program, but all women can access it. And in these policy meetings, I get folks really pushing back to say, oh, well, it needs to include all cultures, and we need to, sorry, I'm being a little dramatic, but that we need to allow all women to have access. And I was like, no, all too often we require people who don't participate in the dominant culture, participate in all sorts of dominant culture treatments, services, sanctions, you name it. That's 2 minutes. That is not okay. Let's try something different. So we are taking a targeted universalism approach and not excluding any populations, but noting that it is not just that African American women spend so much time in jail because we don't have the right alternatives. So we took a risk, we found the data, and now what we can continue to do is get iterative and continue to make sure that the number of sanctions and the length of stay for that population continue to go down. So we've got a starting point. It's not open yet. It will be open in the next couple of months. So I think that's all I had to say. Oh, it is, great. I just wanted to take... No, I got a disclaimer yesterday.
Got it.
One other example I want to give, and then I'll stop talking and leave a minute for questions, is I mentioned we're not only a jail reduction, we're also doing prison reductions, and we have a justice reinvestment program, and all boats didn't rise evenly. White prison-bound offenders benefited more than individuals of color, and our policymakers wanted to understand why. So that's the willingness to talk about it, and what we unpacked is that African American women and Latino men were more likely to get a prison sentence than their white counterparts. And then we were able to dig into those subpopulations to understand a little bit more why. And that's where we are right now. All right. That's it. Thanks.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. So I'm checking. There's supposed to be a break scheduled right now? No. No break? No. We're supposed to go right into John's presentation? But John will give us 5 minutes, right? No? I'll give you 5 minutes back at the break. Okay. So we have time for a few questions. We did get a late start since you were all straggling in. So
You're asleep now.
So
Real cheese.
yeah. So are there some questions? 5 minutes. That's like 3 questions. Come on, you guys. Yes, ma'am.
So since you're in a room full of disciples that believe in what you're trying to do, if you could give us one action step to take back to our community to do, what would that one action step be that you think would get the ball rolling?
Bring James to town. Hello, there we go. He just handed me the mic. I would say do a decision point analysis if you haven't already. The numbers are terrifying and it gets people activated.
I would say listen, set up a listening session very smartly and strategically with the communities that send you the most people. Judicial question.
Okay,
Judicial question.
who's in the warm place? Who lives in the warm place of the presenters?
I think we're warmer than you.
Okay.
We're
Oh,
warmer.
the question is, I started a drug treatment court for adults about a decade ago. It was black and brown, and it's all white now. With opioids, it's probably going to be whiter and whiter. So I think that the two of you may have given me ideas to get a team together, see why the black and brown communities are not flowing that way, et cetera, right?
When we first started justice reinvestment, we found that African American defendants were opting out. And that's because they didn't trust it. Something new, these white people are putting together, what is this? So I think we have to do some myth busting and really talking about chance to not going to prison to be able to get folks to really trust.
Can I say?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say something universally. When I was working with the San Francisco Police Department, they were like, hey, I mean, I love what your thing was, Abby. They were like, okay, we're going to quit busting young people for weed. So that should mean that we're going to reduce disparities. And I'm like, no, where's your radical imagination? Think about it. The people who are selling weed now are business people. You have to have $300,000 to get a license. You can't be Ray Ray on the corner selling weed. So, but that underground economy is still necessary. So if the weed business goes away, what's going to replace it? Because I still need that income. What's going to replace it? In San Francisco, we call them smash and grabs. Smash the window, grab the purse off. It's going to be stealing cars. So let's get ahead of this by thinking we're replacing an economy. We're not just replacing crime.
Again, thank our colleagues for their remarks.